Story number 1. The house that wouldn't let go. We shouldn't have gone in. Deep down, we all knew it was a bad idea, but sometimes curiosity gets the better of you. That's what happened to me, Sarah, Mark, and Jess this summer. We decided to explore the house in Blackwood Forest. It was the kind of place that drew you in, even though every fiber of you being screamed to stay away. The house stood at the edge of the forest, tilted and decaying, as though the earth itself was trying to swallow it whole. The windows were shattered, and the paint had long since peeled away, leaving the wood bare and weathered. Mark had heard about it from a friend, who had heard about it from another friend, the kind of story passed around campfires and whispered in hushed tones. No one's lived there in decades, Mark had said. And the people who go inside? They don't come out. It was the kind of tale you laugh at in broad daylight but can't stop thinking about when night falls. By the time we reached the house, the sun was setting, casting long shadows that stretched across the forest floor. The air around the house felt heavy, like the space itself was holding its breath. None of us said anything as we stood at the doorstep, staring at the rotting wood and the faint markings carved into the frame. Mark, always the fearless one, pushed the door open. "See," he said, grinning. "Nothing to worry about." The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of mildew and rot. The floorboards groaned beneath our feet as we stepped into the foyer, the dim light from outside casting eerie shadows on the walls. The house was larger than it looked from the outside, its hallways stretching farther than seemed possible. Everything about it felt wrong, the way the temperature dropped the farther in we went, the way the silence seemed to press against our ears. "Creepy, but it's just a house," Sarah said, though her voice wavered. She ran her fingers along a dusty banister, leaving trails in the grime. Jess stayed close to me, her hands stuffed in her jacket pockets, her eyes darting to every creak and groan. "Let's check upstairs," Mark said, already heading for the staircase. We split up, a decision I would regret for the rest of my life. The first sign that something was wrong came when Sarah screamed. It was high-pitched, filled with a terror that sent us all running toward her. We found her in a room at the end of the hall, standing in front of a cracked mirror. She was pale, trembling, her eyes wide with fear. "I saw something," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "In the mirror." "It wasn't me." Mark laughed nervously, trying to shake off the tension. "It's just an old mirror," he said, though he didn't look at it for more than a second. I put a hand on Sarah's shoulder, trying to calm her down, but my own heart was racing. I didn't like the way the mirror seemed to hum faintly, as though it were alive. We decided to leave after that. Whatever thrill we'd been chasing had turned sour, replaced by a growing unease that gnawed at the edges of our thoughts. But when we returned to the foyer, the front door was gone. In its place was a wall, the wood seamless and unbroken, as though the door had never existed. Mark cursed, banging his fists against the wall. "What the hell is this?" "It was here," Jess said, her voice shaking. "It was right here." We searched the house, but every time we found what should have been the front door, it led to another hallway or another room. The windows, too, were useless. No matter how hard we tried, they wouldn't break, the glass as solid as steel. Panic set in as we realized the truth, we were trapped. The house began to change after that. At first, it was subtle, the way a hallway seemed longer than before, or how a door we just walked through would lead to a completely different room when we turned around. But soon, it became impossible to ignore. Rooms shifted and twisted, their walls closing in or stretching out like something alive. The furniture moved on its own, chairs scraping across the floor, shadows flickering in ways they shouldn't. And then the house began showing us things. It started with Mark. He opened a door, and instead of a room, he found himself standing on the edge of a cliff, the ocean roaring far below. He froze, staring into the abyss, and for a moment, I thought he might jump. When I pulled him back, his face was pale, his eyes glassy. "It was the day my brother died," he whispered. "I was there. I should have saved him." The house wasn't just a maze, it was a mirror, reflecting our deepest fears and regrets. It knew us, and it wasn't letting us go. Sarah was next. She wandered into a room filled with photographs, hundreds of them, covering every inch of the walls. They were all of her, at school, at home, with her family. But as she moved closer, she realized they weren't just photographs. They were moments. Her moments. And in each one, there was a shadow, just out of focus, watching her. She ran from the room, tears streaming down her face, but the shadow followed, its presence lingering just behind her no matter where she went. Jess and I stayed together, too afraid to split up. The house seemed to sense our fear, feeding off it, twisting it. We found a room filled with children's toys, their bright colors faded and smeared with something dark. A music box sat in the corner, playing a lullaby that sounded almost familiar. When I opened it, I saw a reflection of myself inside, but it wasn't me. It was older, gaunt, with eyes hollowed by despair. It whispered my name, and I slammed the lid shut. We lost track of time. Days blurred together as the house pulled us deeper into its web. We stopped talking about escape and focused on survival, rationing the little food and water we had. But the house wouldn't let us rest. It whispered to us in the dark, its voice soft and insidious, promising release if we just gave in. Mark was the first to break. One night, he simply stood up and walked into the darkness. We heard his footsteps fade, and then, nothing. When we searched for him the next day, all we found was his jacket, draped neatly over a chair. Sarah went next. She stopped eating, stopped speaking, her eyes fixed on something none of us could see. One morning, she was gone, her belongings left untouched. Jess and I didn't talk about it. There was nothing left to say. In the end, it was just me. The house was quieter now, as though it had grown tired of its game. I wandered its halls, my body weak, my mind fraying at the edges. The rooms were empty, their horrors spent, but the silence was worse. It felt like the house was waiting, its patience infinite. I found the front door one day, standing where it had always been. For a moment, hope flared in my chest. But when I stepped through, I wasn't outside. I was back in the house, standing in the foyer, staring at the same door I'd just walked through. The house won't let me leave. It's alive, and it's hungry. If you ever find yourself near Blackwood Forest, stay away from the house. Don't let curiosity draw you in. Because once it has you, it won't let go. And the worst part? It doesn't have to kill you to destroy you. It just makes you wish it had. Story number 2. The fence that can't be crossed. I first heard about the house when I was a kid. It was one of those local legends that got passed down on playgrounds and whispered at sleepovers, always accompanied by exaggerated hand gestures and dramatic pauses. The house itself wasn't anything special, a big, crumbling colonial that sat at the end of a dead-end street on the edge of town. What made it infamous was the fence. It was wrought iron, impossibly tall, with spikes at the top that gleamed even in the dullest light. No one knew who had built it or why it was there. The real mystery, though, was what happened to anyone who tried to climb it. The stories varied, but they all ended the same way: the person vanished. Some said they were swallowed by the house. Others claimed they were pulled into another dimension. A few believed the fence itself was alive, that it wrapped its spiked tendrils around the trespassers and devoured them whole. I didn't believe any of it, of course. Not then. But as I got older, the stories stuck with me. They had a weight to them, a consistency that nagged at the edges of my skepticism. People avoided the house. Even kids dared each other to go no farther than the sidewalk out front. Something about the place just felt wrong. So, naturally, I decided to climb the fence. It wasn't a dare, not exactly. I'd outgrown that kind of bravado by the time I hit my 20s. But curiosity is a dangerous thing, and mine had been gnawing at me for years. The house had become a fixation, the fence a challenge I couldn't shake. I wanted to know what was on the other side. More than that, I wanted to prove the stories wrong. I waited until dusk, when the last rays of sunlight painted the fence in hues of gold and red. The air was still, the kind of quiet that feels alive, like the world is holding its breath. I parked a block away and walked the rest of the distance, my pulse quickening as the house came into view. It looked even more decrepit than I remembered, its windows dark, its roof sagging under the weight of years. The fence was just as imposing, its spikes reaching toward the sky like the teeth of some great, slumbering beast. I hesitated at the base of the fence, my hands gripping the cold metal. Up close, it was even taller than it looked from a distance, the spikes sharper, more menacing. My reflection stared back at me from the polished surface, distorted and strange. For a moment, I considered turning back. But then I heard it, a faint hum, low and rhythmic, coming from the house. It wasn't mechanical, but alive, like a heartbeat. The sound pulled me forward, and before I knew it, I was climbing. The climb itself was easier than I'd expected. The bars were close enough together to provide plenty of handholds, and my adrenaline dulled the sting of the cold metal against my palms. As I reached the top, the hum grew louder, vibrating through my bones. It was almost hypnotic, a song I couldn't resist. I swung my leg over the spikes, careful not to impale myself, and dropped down onto the other side. The moment my feet touched the ground, the hum stopped. The air around me felt heavy, like stepping into a room where someone had just been screaming. The colors of the world seemed muted, the edges of everything blurred, as if I were looking through a smudged lens. I turned to look at the fence, but it was gone. In its place was an impenetrable wall of fog, thick and shimmering, that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The house loomed in front of me, larger now, its shadow swallowing the ground. Its windows were no longer empty, faint lights flickered inside, casting moving silhouettes against the glass. My instinct screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The fog pressed against my back, cold and damp, and the house seemed to beckon me forward. The door creaked open before I reached it, the sound echoing like a scream. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The interior was nothing like I'd expected. It was pristine, immaculate, as if it had been frozen in time. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their crystals catching the faint light of flickering candles. The air smelled of dust and something metallic, like old blood. A grand staircase wound upward, its banister polished to a mirror shine. As I moved deeper into the house, the hum returned, softer now, almost comforting. But there was something else too, whispers. They came from the walls, from the ceiling, from the shadows that pooled in the corners. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading. The first room I entered was a library, its shelves lined with books that seemed too old to touch. Their titles were written in languages I didn't recognize, their spines cracked and faded. A single chair sat in the center of the room, facing a mirror. As I stepped closer, I saw my reflection, or at least, I thought it was mine. The person in the mirror looked like me, but their eyes were different, darker, filled with a fear that didn't match the calm I felt. I turned away, the whispers growing louder, and left way stretched on longer than it should have, each door I passed identical, their brass knobs gleaming in the candlelight. When I tried one, it opened to reveal an empty room, its walls covered in deep scratches, as if someone, or something, had tried to claw their way out. I don't know how long I wandered. Time didn't seem to exist inside the house. Every room was a maze, every hallway a loop that brought me back to where I'd started. The whispers grew louder, angrier, until they became a cacophony of screams. And then, finally, I saw it. At the end of a long corridor stood a figure, tall and gaunt, its features obscured by the shadows. Its head tilted as it regarded me, its presence filling the air with a suffocating weight. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as it began to approach. Its footsteps echoed unnaturally, each one sending a jolt of terror through my body. "Why are you here?" it asked, its voice a low rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I don't know," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. It leaned closer, its face inches from mine. Its eyes were empty, bottomless pits that threatened to swallow me whole. "You crossed the fence. You don't belong here." I woke up outside the fence, sprawled on the cold grass. The house was dark, the hum gone. My hands were scratched and bleeding, my clothes torn, but I was alive. I don't remember how I got out, and I don't want to. I never told anyone what happened. The fence still stands, a silent sentinel guarding its secrets. The house still looms, its windows empty, its doors closed. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the hum. It's faint, barely audible, but it's there, calling me back. And I know that if I ever cross that fence again, I won't come back. Story number 3. The Demon in the Attic. When we moved into the quiet suburban neighborhood of Maple Hollow, it seemed like the perfect place to start over. The house was modest but cozy, surrounded by towering oak trees, with a backyard big enough for our 6-year-old son, Danny, to explore. The neighbors were friendly, the schools were good, and the streets were lined with white picket fences straight out of a postcard. But there was one thing about the neighborhood that felt out of place: a decrepit house at the end of our street. The house loomed like a dark shadow over the otherwise idyllic cul-de-sac. It was an old Victorian, its paint peeling, its windows boarded up. Vines climbed the walls, wrapping around the sagging porch like skeletal fingers. The locals called it the Marwick House, though no one seemed to know who Marwick was or when the house had been abandoned. It was the kind of place kids dared each other to approach, but never actually did. It became a quiet fixture of our new lives, something to avoid and forget. Danny was fascinated with it. From the moment we moved in, I noticed him staring out his bedroom window at the Marwick house, his small hands pressed against the glass. At first, I thought it was simple curiosity. After all, kids are drawn to the mysterious. But as the days passed, his fascination grew. He spent hours in the backyard, kicking a ball around but always glancing toward the house, as if waiting for something. One evening, as I tucked him into bed, he said, "Mom, I have a new friend." "Oh?" I smiled, pulling the blanket up to his chin. "What's their name?" "His name's Jacob," Danny said. "He lives in the attic." A chill ran down my spine. "In the Marwick house?" Danny nodded, his expression innocent but serious. "He says he's been waiting for someone to talk to." I brushed it off as a child's imagination, but it stuck with me. The way Danny spoke about Jacob felt too real. Over the next few days, I kept an eye on him. He spent more and more time in the backyard, his attention fixed on the Marwick house. I caught him talking to himself, his voice low and conspiratorial, like he was sharing secrets. When I asked him who he was talking to, he just shrugged and said, "Jacob." One afternoon, I found Danny standing at the rusted gate that separated our yard from the overgrown lot surrounding the Marwick house. He was staring up at the attic window, his lips moving as if in conversation. "Danny!" I called, my voice sharper than I intended. He turned, startled, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move in the attic window. A shadow, quick and fleeting. But when I looked again, it was gone. That night, I told my husband, Greg, about Danny's new friend. He laughed it off, insisting it was just a phase. "Kids have imaginary friends all the time," he said, sipping his beer. "I had one named Captain Buckaroo. Drove my parents nuts." "This feels different," I said. "He's obsessed with that house. And I swear, I saw something in the window today." Greg's smile faded. "You're letting this get to you. It's just an old house. Nothing more." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I started digging into the history of the Marwick house. Late at night, while Greg and Danny slept, I pored over local archives and internet forums. What I found only deepened my unease. The Marwick house had a long history of tragedy. Over the past century, families who lived there had reported strange occurrences: voices in the walls, footsteps in empty rooms, objects moving on their own. Several children had gone missing over the years, their disappearances never solved. The most chilling detail was the legend of Jacob Marwick, the youngest son of the family who originally built the house. According to the stories, Jacob had been locked in the attic after claiming to see something evil in the shadows. Weeks later, his parents found him dead, his body twisted in unnatural angles, his eyes wide with terror. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that Danny's friend wasn't imaginary. I decided to confront him directly. One rainy afternoon, as thunder rumbled in the distance, I sat him down in the living room. "Danny," I said gently, "can you tell me more about Jacob?" Danny looked up from his coloring book, his face serious. "He's lonely," he said. "He says the people here didn't like him, so they made him stay in the attic. But now he has me." "What do you and Jacob talk about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "He tells me stories," Danny said, "about the bad things that happened in the house. And he says he wants to show me something." "Show you what?" Danny hesitated, his eyes darting toward the window. "The attic." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, felt like a warning. Around midnight, I heard it, a soft tapping sound, coming from Danny's room. I bolted out of bed, Greg close behind me. When we opened Danny's door, he was standing by the window, his hand pressed against the glass. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unfocused. "Danny?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "He's calling me," Danny said, his voice distant. "He wants me to come see him." Greg scooped Danny up and carried him back to bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were losing him. The next morning, we decided to investigate the Marwick house. I couldn't explain why, but I knew we had to confront whatever was inside before it took Danny from us completely. The house was worse up close. The air around it was cold, even in the midday sun, and the smell of rot was overwhelming. The front door creaked open with little resistance, as if the house had been waiting for us. Inside, the air was heavy, the shadows deeper than they should have been. The floorboards groaned beneath our feet as we made our way through the decaying rooms. Every corner seemed to whisper, the faint sound of a child's laughter echoing in the distance. The attic door was at the end of a narrow hallway. It was small, barely noticeable, with a rusted latch that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. When Greg pulled it open, a rush of cold air hit us, carrying the unmistakable scent of death. The attic was dark, but as we climbed the creaking stairs, a faint light began to glow. In the center of the attic was a child's chair, surrounded by dusty toys and crumbling papers. And sitting in the chair was a figure. It was small, its form shrouded in shadow, but its eyes burned with an unnatural light. "You shouldn't be here," it said, its voice layered with something deeper, something ancient. Greg stepped forward, shielding me and Danny, but the figure laughed, a sound that seemed to rattle the walls. "He's mine now," it said. "You brought him to me." The room erupted in chaos. The shadows stretched and twisted, clawing at us as the figure rose from the chair, its form growing, its face contorting into something monstrous. Greg grabbed Danny and ran, dragging me with them. The house seemed to fight us, the walls closing in, the floor buckling beneath our feet. But somehow, we made it out. We never went back to the Marwick house. A week later, the town condemned it and had it torn down, but I know that whatever was inside didn't die with the house. Danny doesn't talk about Jacob anymore, but sometimes, late at night, I catch him staring at his window, his lips moving as if in conversation. And when I ask him who he's talking to, he just smiles and says, "No one." Story number 4. The House That Breathes. It started as a stupid dare, like most bad ideas do. Megan and I had been running a small YouTube channel for a while, mostly urban exploration videos. The kind where you sneak into abandoned buildings and narrate their eerie charm for an audience hungry for cheap thrills. We'd done the usual fare, shuttered factories, forgotten mansions, derelict hospitals, but nothing quite like the house everyone in town called the Breathing House. The stories were all the same. People claimed you could hear it before you saw it, the slow, rhythmic creak of its walls expanding and contracting, like the house itself was alive. Some said the floorboards pulsed underfoot, like veins coursing with blood. Most people laughed it off as a hoax, but that didn't stop the legends from spreading. It was irresistible bait for us. We had to see it for ourselves. More importantly, we had to capture it on film. Megan was skeptical at first. She wasn't as easily spooked as me, but even she admitted there was something unsettling about the stories. "A living house? Come on," she'd said, smirking as she packed our gear. "What's next, a talking refrigerator?" I laughed, but there was an edge to it. As ridiculous as it sounded, the Breathing House felt different, heavier, like the kind of place that doesn't just scare you, it stays with you. We drove out to the outskirts of town just before sunset. The house stood at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by a forest that seemed unnaturally still. It was massive, an old Victorian monstrosity with peeling paint and boarded-up windows. Vines clung to its exterior like veins, wrapping around the sagging porch and the broken shutters. The air felt wrong, thick and heavy, like we'd stepped into a different world. Megan set up her camera, her face lit with excitement. "Ready to make history?" she asked, her grin wide. I nodded, my hand shaking just slightly as I gripped my flashlight. We pushed open the front door, and the sound it made was the first clue that something wasn't right. It didn't creak, it groaned, low and guttural, like the sound of a giant waking from slumber. The air inside was thick with the smell of rot and mildew, but there was something else too, something metallic, like blood. I shivered, and Megan gave me a look. "Don't chicken out on me now," she said, her voice teasing but her eyes wary. The house was silent, but not in the way abandoned buildings usually are. It was an expectant silence, the kind that presses against your ears and makes your heart race. The floorboards beneath our feet felt strange, not just creaky but soft, almost pliable. As we moved deeper into the house, I started to notice it, the faintest sound, low and rhythmic, like breathing. Megan heard it too. She stopped in her tracks, her camera pointed at the hallway ahead. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, too afraid to speak. The sound grew louder as we walked, steady and deliberate, each exhale accompanied by a faint creak of the walls. The air felt warmer now, damp and heavy, as if the house itself was exhaling against our skin. Megan kept filming, her movements slower, more cautious. "This is insane," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the rhythmic sound. "It's like it's alive." We found ourselves in what must have been the living room. The wallpaper was faded and peeling, the furniture covered in tattered sheets. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth dark and empty. But the strangest part was the floor. It seemed to rise and fall ever so slightly, like the chest of a sleeping giant. Megan crouched down, her camera inches from the floorboards. "You're getting this, right?" I asked, my voice shaking. She nodded, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and awe. Then the house shuddered. It wasn't violent, not at first, just a subtle shift, like it was adjusting its weight. But it was enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "We should go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Megan hesitated, torn between her instincts and the lure of the perfect shot. "Just a little longer," she said. But then the house groaned again, louder this time, and the floor beneath her seemed to ripple. She stumbled back, her camera shaking as she caught herself against the wall. "Okay, you're right. Let's go." We turned to leave, but the hallway we'd come through was gone. In its place was a narrow corridor that twisted in ways that didn't make sense. The walls seemed to pulse, the wood expanding and contracting like lungs. Megan swore under her breath, her voice trembling. "What the hell is this?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that the house wasn't just alive, it was awake. We moved quickly, our breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. Every door we tried led to more hallways, each one darker and narrower than the last. The breathing sound was louder now, almost deafening, and the floor felt like it was moving beneath us. Megan grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "It's leading us somewhere," she said, her voice frantic. "We have to find another way out." But there was no way out. The house had closed in around us, its walls shifting and folding like a living organism. We stumbled into what must have been the kitchen, but it was barely recognizable. The counters were covered in a thick, pulsing substance, and the air was suffocatingly warm. The walls seemed to close in, their surfaces glistening like flesh. Megan pointed her camera at the ceiling, her hands shaking. It's breathing," she said, her voice barely audible. The house shuddered again, and this time, it was violent. The floor buckled beneath us, sending us crashing into the wall. I heard Megan scream, but the sound was swallowed by the deafening groan of the house. I scrambled to my feet, my flashlight flickering as I grabbed her arm. "We have to keep moving," I shouted, my voice hoarse. But the house had other plans. The walls seemed to come alive, their surfaces rippling as if something was moving beneath them. A crack appeared in the floor, and from it came a low, guttural sound, like the growl of a predator. Megan's camera hit the ground, the lens shattering as she was pulled backward by something I couldn't see. I lunged for her, but my hands closed on empty air. She was gone. The house groaned again, its walls pressing in around me. I could feel its breath on my skin, hot and suffocating, as the floor began to ripple beneath my feet. I stumbled forward, my flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. The breathing sound was everywhere now, surrounding me, filling my head. I don't remember how I got out. One moment, I was inside the house, and the next, I was lying on the ground outside, gasping for air. The house loomed behind me, silent and still, as if nothing had happened. Megan was never found. Her camera, shattered and covered in something dark and sticky, was the only trace of her we recovered. I tried to tell people what happened, but no one believed me. The breathing house became just another story, another urban legend to scare kids. But I know the truth. The house is alive, and it's waiting. And if you're foolish enough to go inside, it won't let you leave. Story number 5. Whispers from the basement. The house sat on the edge of town, crumbling under the weight of years and silence. Everyone in the area knew about the Whisper House, as they called it. Stories had circulated for decades, the original owners fleeing in the middle of the night, the next family abandoning it after just a few months, and the most recent occupants leaving everything behind as if they couldn't get away fast enough. Every story shared one detail: the whispers. They came at night, soft at first, then growing louder, insistent, until no one could bear to stay. I first heard about the house from Jason, the self-proclaimed leader of our little group of urban explorers. He had a knack for finding places with the kind of dark history that got us views. He called us together one night, his eyes alight with the thrill of discovery. "This place," he said, slapping a grainy photo of the house on the table, "is the real deal. It's not just creaky floorboards or shadows on the walls. People say they hear voices. Actual voices. From the basement." The rest of us, Laura, Mike, and I, exchanged skeptical glances. We'd been to our share of haunted places, most of which turned out to be nothing more than wind through old pipes or the power of suggestion. But Jason had a way of making you believe, of convincing you that this time, it would be different. A week later, we stood in front of the Whisper House, flashlights and cameras in hand. It looked even worse in person, its windows dark and empty, its roof sagging like the house itself was tired of existing. The air around it was colder than it should have been, and the wind carried a faint, sour smell that made my stomach churn. "Creepy," Laura said, adjusting her camera strap. Mike snorted. "It's just a house. Let's get this over with." Jason led the way, the old wooden door groaning as he pushed it open. The interior was as decrepit as you'd expect, dust-covered furniture, peeling wallpaper, and an air of abandonment that seemed to cling to your skin. But there was something else, too, something harder to define. It was the feeling of being watched, of something just out of sight waiting for you to look the other way. We moved through the house in silence, the only sounds the creak of the floorboards and the faint hum of our equipment. Jason pointed to the door leading to the basement, its surface scratched and worn. "That's where the whispers come from," he said, his voice low. "People say it starts slow, like someone calling your name, then builds until it's all you can hear." I felt a chill run down my spine as I stared at the door. It looked ordinary enough, but there was something about it that made my stomach twist. Laura gave a nervous laugh. "Well, we're not here to chicken out, are we?" Jason grinned. "That's the spirit." The basement smelled worse than the rest of the house, a damp, earthy stench that made me gag. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing cracked concrete walls and a dirt floor. At first, it seemed empty, just another creepy old basement. But then we heard it, a faint whisper, so soft it could have been the wind. "Did you hear that?" Jason whispered. We all nodded, our eyes wide. The whisper grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just noise, it was words, though I couldn't make them out. They were fragmented, overlapping, like 100 voices speaking at once. My chest tightened as the sound filled the room, pressing against my ears like a physical force. "Jason," I said, my voice shaking. "What the hell is this?" Jason didn't answer. He was staring at the far wall, his flashlight fixed on something I hadn't noticed before, a door. It was small, almost hidden, its surface covered in strange, jagged symbols that looked like they'd been carved with a knife. "This wasn't in the floor plans," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. Before any of us could stop him, he was at the door, his fingers tracing the carvings. "Jason, don't," Laura started, but it was too late. The door swung open with a low groan, revealing a narrow stone staircase that descended into darkness. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was down there knew we were coming. We shouldn't go down there, Mike said, his voice unsteady. Jason ignored him, his camera already rolling as he started down the steps. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn around, but I couldn't leave him. None of us could. The staircase seemed to go on forever, the air growing colder and heavier with each step. The walls were slick with moisture, and the whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. When we reached the bottom, the sight that greeted us was worse than anything I could have imagined. It was a cavern, vast and ancient, its walls covered in the same jagged symbols as the door. In the center of the room was a massive, blackened pit, its edges lined with chains that hung limply, as if they were waiting to bind something or someone. The whispers seemed to pour out of the pit, a swirling mass of voices that begged, screamed, and wept. "What is this?" Laura whispered, her face pale. Jason stepped closer to the pit, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "It's alive," he said, his voice filled with awe. The ground beneath us shuddered, and a low, guttural sound rose from the pit, deeper and more menacing than the whispers. Something was moving in the shadows, something massive and impossible. I grabbed Jason's arm. "We need to leave. Now." But the door was gone. The staircase we'd come down was nothing more than solid stone. The whispers grew louder, more desperate, and the air itself seemed to close in around us. Jason screamed as one of the chains shot upward, wrapping around his leg and dragging him toward the pit. We tried to pull him back, but it was like the chains were alive, their grip unbreakable. He disappeared into the darkness, his scream swallowed by the whispers. The room began to collapse, the walls cracking and crumbling as the ground shook. Laura and Mike were screaming, but I couldn't hear them over the roar of the pit. The last thing I remember is the floor giving way beneath us, the darkness rushing up to meet me. I woke up outside the house, the sun rising over the trees. Laura and Mike were nowhere to be found, and Jason was gone. The house had returned to its silent, decrepit state, but I could still hear the whispers, faint and insistent, calling me back. I don't know how I escaped, and I don't want to. All I know is that the house isn't just a house, it's a doorway. And whatever's on the other side is hungry. Story number 6. Reflections. The house at the edge of Willow Creek had always been the source of whispered legends. A crumbling Victorian relic, it stood shrouded in ivy and shadow, its once grand exterior now a faded skeleton of its former glory. Locals called it the Glass House, though not for the reasons you'd expect. Its nickname came from the massive mirror in the living room, a relic left behind by the last owners who, according to town lore, fled in the dead of night without so much as a goodbye. They'd left everything behind, furniture, dishes, even family photographs. Everything, that is, except the mirror. I'd heard the stories growing up. There were the kind of tales that kids used to scare each other on Halloween, the kind that lingered in the back of your mind long after the lights went out. They said the mirror wasn't just a mirror. They said it was a window. If you stared at it long enough, you'd see things, terrible things. Reflections that didn't quite match your movements. Figures lurking just out of frame. And if you looked too long, they said, you might not like what looked back at you. I didn't believe any of it, of course. Not until I stood in front of the mirror myself. It started as a dare, like all bad decisions do. My friends and I had been drinking a little too much, and the topic of the glass house came up. Someone suggested we check it out, and before I knew it, I was standing on its creaking porch, flashlight in hand. The air was heavy, the kind of suffocating stillness that makes your skin crawl. The front door was unlocked, the wood swollen from years of rain and neglect. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of mildew and something metallic. The floorboards groaned under our weight as we stepped inside. And then, there it was. The mirror. It was enormous, its frame carved from dark wood and covered in intricate designs, twisting vines, snarling faces, and symbols I didn't recognize. The glass was impossibly clean, reflecting the dim light of our flashlights with an almost hypnotic clarity. For a moment, none of us said anything. We just stared, the weight of the mirror's presence pressing down on us like a physical force. "Go on," one of my friends said, his voice tinged with nervous laughter. "Take a look. What are you scared of?" I wasn't scared. Not really. At least, that's what I told myself as I stepped closer, the floorboards creaking beneath my boots. My reflection stared back at me, perfectly ordinary. Same tousled hair, same 5 o'clock shadow, same slightly crooked nose. Nothing unusual. But as I stared, a strange feeling crept over me. It was subtle at first, a faint unease that prickled at the back of my neck. The room behind me in the reflection seemed darker than it should have been, the shadows deeper, more alive. I could see my friends standing behind me, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of their flashlights. But something felt wrong. Then my reflection smiled. I wasn't smiling. My lips were pressed together in a tight line, my expression tense. But the man in the mirror, he was grinning, wide and toothy, like he knew a joke I didn't. The sight of it sent a jolt of cold fear through me, and I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. "What's wrong?" one of my friends asked, stepping closer. "Nothing," I said quickly, trying to steady my breathing. "I just thought I saw something." They laughed, but it sounded forced, their nerves clearly as frayed as mine. I didn't look at the mirror again. Not then. Not until later, when I was alone. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man in the mirror, my reflection, grinning at me with that too wide smile. It wasn't just fear that kept me awake. It was something worse. Curiosity. What had I seen? Was it just a trick of the light, my mind playing tricks on me? Or was it something else? Something real? By the time the sun rose, I'd made up my mind. I had to go back. The house felt different in the daylight. Less threatening, though no less eerie. The mirror was still there, looming in the living room like a dark sentinel. I stood in front of it again, alone this time, and forced myself to stare. At first, everything seemed normal. My reflection moved when I moved, its expression matching mine exactly. But the longer I looked, the more I noticed the little inconsistencies. The slight delay in its movements. The way its eyes seemed to follow me even when I stood still. And then, just as before, it smiled. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The reflection's grin widened, its teeth impossibly sharp. "I'm you," it said, though its lips didn't move. The voice was in my head, cold and sharp, like the edge of a blade. "And you're mine." Before I could react, the mirror's surface rippled like water, and the world around me twisted. The living room blurred, the colors bleeding together until they were nothing but darkness. I tried to step back, but my feet wouldn't move. My reflection reached out, its hand pressing against the glass from the other side. And then, in one horrifying moment, it pulled me through. I don't know how long I've been here. Time doesn't work the same way in the mirror. The world outside looks almost normal, but it's like watching a movie on an old, flickering screen. I can see the living room, the dusty furniture, the broken floorboards. I can see the house as it was, too, filled with the ghostly echoes of lives long past. But most of all, I can see him, my reflection. He's on the other side now, wearing my face, living my life. And he's good at it. No one suspects a thing. I've tried to get out. I've screamed, pounded on the glass, begged for someone to notice. But no one does. They just see their own reflections, their own faces staring back at them, and they never look long enough to see me. The worst part is the others. I'm not alone in here. There are dozens of us, maybe hundreds, all trapped in the mirror's endless, shifting maze. Some have been here for centuries, their faces twisted into grotesque masks of despair. They whisper to me sometimes, their voices echoing through the darkness. "It's hungry," they say. "It always needs more." So if you ever find yourself standing in front of a mirror, staring too long, remember this: don't trust what you see. Because sometimes, it's not your reflection looking back. Sometimes, it's something else. And if it smiles at you, run. Story number 7. The Party That Never Ends. The house on Sycamore Hill had always been a mystery. For decades, it stood there, a decaying relic of the Jazz Age, with ivy creeping up its weathered stone walls and broken windows that seemed to watch you as you passed. Nobody knew who owned it anymore, and nobody wanted to. The locals whispered about strange lights flickering inside on moonless nights and the faint echo of music, soft, lilting jazz that didn't belong in this century. Most people avoided the place. Most people were smarter than me. I first heard the stories when I moved to town. Stay away from the Sycamore house, the clerk at the corner store had said when I mentioned exploring the area. It's not right. People go in and, well, you don't hear from them again. I laughed it off, thinking it was just small-town superstition. But the house intrigued me. I'd always been drawn to the eerie and unexplained, and the thought of unraveling the mystery of Sycamore Hill was too tempting to resist. It wasn't hard to find. Even without directions, the house practically called to me, its silhouette rising against the evening sky like a dark beacon. The gate creaked open with an almost theatrical groan as I stepped onto the overgrown path leading to the front door. The air around the house felt heavy, charged, like the stillness before a thunderstorm. I hesitated for a moment, the weight of the silence pressing against my chest. Then I heard it, a faint strain of music, soft and haunting, drifting through the air like a ghost. The front door wasn't locked. It swung open with surprising ease, revealing a grand foyer bathed in a dim, golden light. The chandelier above, though covered in cobwebs, cast a flickering glow that seemed to pulse in time with the distant music. The floor was covered in dust, but there were no footprints, nothing to suggest anyone had walked here in years. And yet, the house didn't feel empty. I followed the sound of the music, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and curiosity. It led me to the ballroom, a vast space with vaulted ceilings and tarnished mirrors lining the walls. And there, in the center of the room, was the party. They were dressed in 1920s fashion, flappers in glittering dresses, men in sharp tuxedos, their faces alive with laughter and conversation. The music was coming from a live band at the far end of the room, their instruments shining under the flickering light of a massive crystal chandelier. The smell of champagne and cigar smoke hung in the air, mingling with the faint scent of decay. It was surreal, like stepping into a photograph from another era. Nobody seemed to notice me at first. They danced and drank and laughed, their voices blending into a strange, hypnotic hum. I was frozen in place, unable to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew to be real. Then a woman broke away from the crowd and walked toward me. She was stunning, her dark hair curled into perfect waves, her lips painted a deep red that contrasted sharply with her pale skin. Her dress sparkled like starlight as she moved, and her eyes were fixed on mine with an intensity that made my stomach churn. "You made it," she said, her voice smooth and warm. "We've been waiting for you." I shouldn't be here," I stammered, taking a step back. "Nonsense," she said, her smile widening. "The party is for everyone. Come, have a drink." Before I could protest, she looped her arm through mine and led me into the crowd. Glasses clinked as she handed me a champagne flute, the bubbles shimmering like liquid gold. "Drink," she said, her eyes locked on mine. I took a sip, more out of politeness than anything else, and the room seemed to tilt. The lights grew brighter, the music louder, and the air around me felt electric. For a moment, I forgot everything, why I'd come here, the warnings, even my own name. All that mattered was the party. But then I caught my reflection in one of the mirrors lining the walls. My face stared back at me, but it wasn't quite right. My eyes were too wide, my smile too sharp, my movements slightly out of sync with the person I knew myself to be. I turned away, but the image lingered in the corner of my vision, watching me, mocking me. I started to notice other things, too. The dancers moved with an unnatural grace, their bodies bending in ways that didn't seem possible. The laughter, once warm and inviting, now sounded hollow, like it was coming from far away. And the music, it wasn't just playing, it was alive, pulsing through the air like a heartbeat. "I need to go," I said, turning to the woman who had brought me in. She laughed, a low, melodic sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Go? But the party's just begun." I backed away, pushing through the crowd, but the room seemed to stretch around me, the walls bending and shifting like a funhouse maze. The dancers closed in, their faces blurring and melting as they reached for me with hands that were too long, too thin. "You can't leave," the woman said, her voice echoing in my head. "Nobody ever leaves." I stumbled into the foyer, my heart racing as I tried to find the front door. It was gone, replaced by a solid wall. The music grew louder, the laughter sharper, and the air around me seemed to vibrate with a malevolent energy. Then I felt it, a hand on my shoulder, cold and heavy. I turned, and there she was, her face inches from mine. Her eyes were black voids, her smile stretching impossibly wide. "Stay," she whispered. "Stay with us forever." The last thing I remember is her laugh, echoing in my ears as the room went dark. I don't know how long I've been here. Days? Weeks? Time doesn't exist at the party. The music never stops, the lights never dim, and the guests never leave. I see new faces sometimes, wide-eyed and terrified, pulled into the dance just like I was. I try to warn them, but my voice is drowned out by the music. And then there are the mirrors. They show me what I've become, a twisted, hollow version of myself, trapped in a never-ending celebration. The party is eternal, and so is the prison. If you ever find yourself on Sycamore Hill, stay away from the house. Don't listen to the music, don't follow the lights, and for the love of God, don't drink the champagne. Because once you join the party, you can never leave. Story number 8. The Library of the Dead. The house stood at the end of Ashmore Lane, a brooding relic of another time. It belonged to Silas Crane, one of the greatest writers of his era, who had lived and died in that house decades ago. His works were the kind that lingered in the mind, unsettling in their honesty and brimming with the horrors of human nature. Crane's death had been as enigmatic as his life. They found him in his study, slumped over his desk, a pen still clutched in his hand. Beside him lay a manuscript, his final story, untitled and unpublished. No one knew what it was about, because after his funeral, the manuscript disappeared. I'd always been fascinated by Crane. As a struggling writer, I idolized him. His works were dark and brilliant, the kind of stories that made you question yourself. When I learned that his house was still standing, untouched and unsold, it felt like destiny. My friends thought I was crazy when I said I wanted to visit, but they didn't understand. This wasn't just a house, it was history. Maybe even inspiration. The night I arrived, the air was thick with the smell of rain and the earthy scent of decay. The house loomed over me, its windows dark and empty, like hollow eyes. The front door creaked open easily, as if it had been waiting for me. The inside was almost as I'd imagined it, dust-covered furniture, faded wallpaper, and the faint smell of old books. But it wasn't just abandoned, it felt alive, as if the house itself were holding its breath. I made my way to the library, the place I'd been dreaming of for years. It was breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, crammed with volumes that ranged from leather-bound classics to cheap paperbacks. The air was heavy with the scent of aged paper and ink. But what caught my attention most was the desk in the corner, where Silas Crane had written his masterpieces. On it sat an oil lamp, a stack of yellowed paper, and a single book. The book was small and unassuming, bound in cracked leather. There was no title on the cover, no indication of its contents. I picked it up carefully, my heart racing. This had to be it, his final manuscript, the one no one had ever read. My hands trembled as I opened it, the pages rough and brittle beneath my fingers. The first line was simple, but it sent a chill down my spine. They say a story only ends when no one is left to tell it. I couldn't stop reading. The words seemed to pull me in, the prose vivid and unsettling, as if Crane had reached through the years to whisper them directly into my mind. The story was about a man who finds a book, a cursed book that brings its characters to life. They haunt him, torment him, until he's driven to madness. And as I read, I began to feel it, the presence of something watching me, just beyond the edge of my vision. The first sign that something was wrong came when I heard the whispers. They were faint at first, barely audible over the creak of the old house. But as I turned each page, they grew louder, more insistent. I looked around, but I was alone. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and shift, as if alive. I told myself it was just my imagination, the power of Crane's writing playing tricks on me. But then I heard the footsteps. They were soft, deliberate, coming from somewhere above me. My pulse quickened as I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. The house was supposed to be empty. I set the book down and crept out of the library, my footsteps muffled by the threadbare carpet. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the moon through the cracked windows. The stairs creaked under my weight as I climbed them, each step echoing in the silence. At the top of the stairs, the air felt colder, heavier. The whispers were louder now, swirling around me like a swarm of bees. I followed the sound to a door at the end of the hallway, its surface warped with age. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob, and when I turned it, the door swung open with a groan. The room was empty, save for a single chair facing the window. But as I stepped inside, I saw them, figures, faint and flickering, like shadows cast by an unseen flame. They stood in the corners of the room, their eyes glowing faintly, their forms shifting and indistinct. And then one of them turned to me. It was the man from the book. The one Crane had written about, the cursed protagonist haunted by his own imagination. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, but his expression was one of desperate longing. "You read it," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "You shouldn't have." The room seemed to close in around me, the shadows pressing against my skin. The figures stepped closer, their movements slow and deliberate, like predators stalking their prey. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The man smiled, a crooked, joyless grin. "We want you to finish the story." I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The shadows lunged, and I ran, the house a blur of dark hallways and slamming doors. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air, the book still clutched in my hand. The whispers followed me, faint but relentless, even as I drove away. That was weeks ago, but I can't escape them. The characters haunt my every waking moment, their voices a constant murmuring in my ears. They appear in reflections, in the corners of my vision, always watching, always waiting. I tried to burn the book, but the flames wouldn't touch it. I tried to throw it away, but it always finds its way back to me. I've come to understand the truth now. Silas Crane didn't die of natural causes. The story killed him, and now it's trying to kill me. But I can't let it end here. I have to finish it, to write the ending that Crane couldn't. Maybe then, the whispers will stop. Or maybe I'll become one of them, another character in the cursed library, waiting for the next fool to turn the page. If you ever find a book without a title, leave it alone. Some stories aren't meant to be read. Story number 9. The Faces on the Wall. The house at the edge of town was a relic from another time, a forgotten monument to a family no one seemed to remember. It was a Victorian-era monstrosity, with peeling paint and broken shutters, its windows dark like lifeless eyes. People called it the Holloway House, though no one could tell you who the Holloways were or where they had gone. It was just there, part of the landscape, avoided but never truly ignored. I wasn't the kind of person who believed in ghost stories, but I had heard them all. The rumors about the Holloway House were the kind that stuck with you. They said no one stayed in the house for long. It wasn't the creaking floors or the drafts or even the faint, inexplicable whispers at night. It was the photos. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, covering the walls of every room. Black and white images of a family frozen in time, parents, children, grandparents, all staring out with blank, unreadable expressions. People said that the photos changed. At first, subtly. A shift in posture, a different expression. But then, as the house got its hooks into you, you'd see yourself among them. I didn't believe it. Not at first. But when I heard about the house being put up for sale, I couldn't resist. I wasn't interested in buying it, of course. I was a freelance photographer with a fascination for the macabre, and the Holloway House was the perfect subject for my next project. I thought it would be simple, a few hours in the house, snapping photos of its eerie charm, then back to my apartment to edit and post online. I wasn't prepared for what I found. The house was exactly as I'd imagined it, decrepit, oppressive, and eerily quiet. The air inside was thick with the smell of mildew and something metallic, like rusted iron. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight, the sound echoing through the empty halls. But the photos, that's what struck me first. They were everywhere, lining the walls from floor to ceiling. Each one was encased in a simple wooden frame, their glass surfaces clouded with dust. I ran my fingers over one, clearing the glass. A family of 4 stared back at me, a mother, a father, 2 children. Their faces were blank, their eyes lifeless, as though they'd been drained of whatever spark had once animated them. I moved deeper into the house, my camera clicking as I documented every detail. The photos were all the same family in different poses, different rooms, different seasons. But there was something unsettling about them, something I couldn't quite place. As I moved through the house, I began to notice the changes. At first, it was subtle. A picture I could have sworn showed 2 children now only showed 1. A father's smile in one frame was replaced by a grimace in another. My heart pounded as I moved from room to room, the photos shifting in ways that made my skin crawl. In the dining room, I stopped cold. There was a photo on the wall that hadn't been there before. It was fresh, the glass clean and polished. And it showed me. I was standing in the entryway, my camera slung over my shoulder, staring directly at the lens. My breath caught in my throat as I turned to look at the hallway behind me, but it was empty. When I looked back at the photo, the image had changed. I wasn't alone anymore. A figure stood behind me, a tall, shadowy presence with no discernible features, just a mass of darkness that seemed to hum with malice. I ran. My heart pounded as I sprinted toward the front door, but when I grabbed the knob, it wouldn't budge. The air around me felt heavier, thicker, as though the house itself were alive, pressing against me, keeping me inside. I could feel its presence now, all around me, watching, waiting. The photos seemed to shift and move in the corner of my eye, their blank faces turning to follow me as I backed into the living room. The walls in the living room were completely covered in photos now, not an inch of wallpaper visible. And they were changing, faster than before. In one frame, the family stood smiling in front of a Christmas tree. In the next, the tree was gone, and their faces were twisted in terror. And then I saw myself again, standing in the corner of the living room, the shadowy figure now looming over me. I turned, but there was nothing there, just the empty room and the faint hum of something unseen. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I woke up, the house was dark. The photos were closer now, their frames crowding the walls, the faces inside more vivid, more alive. I could see the fear in their eyes, the way their hands reached out, as though begging for help. And I could hear it now, the whispers. Soft, desperate murmurs that filled the room, words I couldn't quite make out. They were coming from the walls, from the photos, from the very air around me. I tried the door again, but it was useless. The house wasn't going to let me leave. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as I moved back toward the dining room. And then I saw it. My photo was gone, replaced by an empty frame. My heart sank as I realized what that meant. I was already part of the house. I wasn't just trapped, I was becoming one of them. I don't know how long I've been here now. Time doesn't work the same way in this place. The photos are still changing, the faces growing more distorted, more desperate. I see myself in them sometimes, my face frozen in terror, my hands pressed against the glass as though trying to escape. But there's no escape. The house has me now, and it won't let go. If you ever hear about the Holloway house, if someone dares you to explore it, don't. Walk away. Burn it to the ground if you have to. Because once you step inside, you're already part of it. The photos on the wall are waiting, and they always have room for one more.